Right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the June 3rd Thursday Web Forum. Let's go ahead and get started. I've got 2 after 10 Eastern here in Raleigh. I am Hillary Morris. As always, I work on user support and communications for both the Southeast and the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprints. And we host this webinar right here at 10 a.m. every month to share the latest updates on the blueprint, to get input and involvement from folks like y'all, and share exciting science in the world of landscape conservation in our region. So here is the agenda for today. As usual, I'll start by introducing our speaker, who will present for 30 to 40 minutes on the monthly topic, and then we'll have Q&A and discussion at the end, and I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar. So as a heads up, you probably already saw the banner at the top of your Teams meeting, but I am recording this web forum, and we always do that just to give an option for the 1 or 2 people who inevitably wanted to attend but had a conflict. The slides and the link to the video will be posted on the calendar event on both the SECAS and the South Atlantic websites within a couple of days. Any questions or comments before we get started? All right, hearing none, here is our presentation for today. Mo Correll, the science coordinator for the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, will be giving her talk today, and she'll be talking about collaborative conservation of coastal marsh systems and some of the science work that the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture is doing toward that work. So Mo, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, and you can share.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hillary. All right. Everyone, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to present. As Hillary said, I thought I would just go through the science and the kind of structure for the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture and what we've been up to the last couple of years, so you know about the resources that are available through our collaborative. So just as a refresher, the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, ACJV, is a conservation collaborative. So it's a regional partnership of state and federal, as well as nonprofit and private conservation entities, and we're all focused on conserving coastal marsh systems. And when we say coastal marsh systems, that really is a combination of the salt marsh systems, as well as the brackish and freshwater tidal marsh that you sometimes find along the coastline. Now, unfortunately, climate change is driving accelerated sea level rise along this Atlantic coastline, and past marsh modifications that we see can really impede the natural and existing mechanisms that marsh has to keep up with sea level rise, namely accretion. Let's see. So really, kind of understanding this problem a little bit more, the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture decided to focus exclusively on coastal marsh systems, and then selected 3 flagship species in 2015 and 16 through the Conservation Collaborative and Management Board, and came up with this list of 3: the Eastern black rail, the American black duck, and the salt marsh sparrow. And all 3 of these species use coastal marsh systems within all or part of their life cycle. So I will just go through what we've been working on science-wise for the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture by species, and then I will give you a little tour of our website at the end to show you how to access these resources. So first, the Eastern black rail. Now, the Eastern black rail, again, a lot of you are probably familiar with the general life history of the black rail, but it's a very tiny and cryptic bird. So this bird is, depending on the size of your monitor, showed larger than it actually is. It's more or less the size of your fist, and can be found in tidal as well, in coastal tidal, as well as inland marshes along the coastline, namely from New Jersey down to Florida. Now, we do know that this bird is declining quite quickly, roughly 9% annually. However, actually tracking this trend for the species has been quite difficult because they are so hard to monitor for in the first place. They're very hard to detect. And also knowing exactly when to go out and try to detect them and how often to detect them is something that we're still working on. These black rails have historically actually occurred across the Northeast and down into the Southeast, but this is the more or less their current extent, starting in New Jersey and going down into Florida. And you can see in Florida, there's a very robust inland population, but we know that, within the other states as well, black rail can exist in inland wetlands, and because of the issues inherent with sea level rise along the coastline, the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture has really been focused on trying to create and support habitat for black rail in these inland areas. Now, with all of our flagship species, we have developed a plan, a conservation plan, to help partners move forward in putting habitat on the ground for the species in an organized fashion. So this is one of 3 plans that are available on our website. And within all of these plans, we create population objectives and habitat goals. So you can see the population objective kind of plotted out here for the black rail with year on the bottom and the number of pairs on the y-axis. And you can see the blue line shows the goal population of 2,500 pairs that we're working to get to by 2056 to avoid the genetic bottleneck, but that might otherwise happen for the species. Well, how exactly do we do this? Well, because a lot of management and action happens at the state level, we've broken down these goals into state level numbers, and so you can see them shown here. This exists again for all of our flagship species, and I'll reference each one of those as we go through the different species. However, actually making sure that these goals get met is much easier said than done, and that's because, again, black rails are kind of this really mystical and not understudied, but hard to study bird. And they're very particular in what they like, and we're still learning what exactly they like on the ground. This is a figure that actually came from Brian Watts, who works for the College of William and Mary on black rail ecology. And he has a series of slides that really kind of shows, this green bar that you see in the middle is what rails like, but it's very, very easy to get into an area where it's either too wet or too dry for these rails. Sometimes even variation of a couple different centimeters along the ground will mean that you may or may not see a black rail in the area. And unfortunately, the conditions on the ground vary quite a bit. You don't often see an area holding the same amount of water across the entire year. And so actually hitting that sweet spot for rails is pretty difficult, not only when it comes to hydrology, but also when it comes to cover or vegetation. You see rails really going for areas that have some amount of vegetative cover. However, if too much of that cover is woody or not enough of it is woody or generally is not quite covered enough to provide protection for those rails, you don't see them. And again, conditions on the ground can really vary across that sweet spot, making it difficult to predict where these rails occur. So how exactly do we get there of the sweet spot where there's the right amount of water, the right amount of vegetation? There's a couple different management strategies that we can use to get there: prescribed fire, chemical management of vegetation, topographic manipulation or elevation, irrigation, and grazing management. We are still in the beginning processes for understanding what kind of management strategies will actually work for this bird. But really, a lot of this and all of this is happening through partnership, which drives the change that we see. And we have a mighty group of black rail experts and biologists, those really working hard in the field. They're out in the field working right now to try to move forward and move the needle towards understanding more about what these birds need and actually creating more habitat on the ground to help them. So I'll just go through the different efforts that are ongoing right now. And a lot of this is really just descriptive because we're still working towards getting results and projects on the ground. One is that there is a group of black rail experts across all of the states that have black rail populations that need monitoring to identify and develop a regional monitoring protocol for the black rail. And in addition to that, also create regulatory protocols for the black rail. Black rail is threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so because of that, we need to have guidance to inform when we need to know if there's a black rail in an area, if development is going to happen in a certain area. How do we figure out if a black rail is there? What protocols do we use? How often do we need to visit there? So that group meets monthly right now, and we hope to have a finalized protocol for regional monitoring to help estimate populations and also estimate trends over time by the end of the year. We also have a partnership going with the USGS on adaptive management for black rails. And really, this has been a structured decision-making process where black rail experts over the past 3 years have convened at a series of workshops, both in person and virtual once the pandemic started, to help identify the things that are most important to learn about management for black rail habitat, and then also create the structure to help evaluate and come up with larger scale inference once these things start happening on the ground. So we're doing that using Bayesian belief networks, and we're evaluating 2 partner-derived hypotheses, one involving irrigation and the other involving comparing fire or prescribed fire to herbicide treatments to control vegetation in the area. And this is headed up by Jim Lyons and Alex Godar, both through the USGS. Additionally, we also have a multi-state effort to create black rail habitat in the Southeast, and this is funded through a competitive state wildlife grant that was awarded, I believe, last year. This is headed up by Florida Fish and Wildlife. However, there are multiple states, obviously, contributing, including Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. Now, the reason the image changed right here is because in addition to creating black rail habitat on the ground, this group has been working pretty hard to try and develop protocols that we can use at all of our sites to accurately measure hydrology and elevation change as these projects start to happen on the ground. And we've been, doing a lot of legwork to figure out if the use of UASs, unmanned aircraft systems, or drones is really the way forward there. So, stay tuned for more on that. We're still really just in the brainstorming stages of this, but I think, there's enough momentum with this particular idea that we're hopeful that we can use some kind of UAS-based measurement for elevation and potentially hydrology as well at these sites. Finally, at the ACJV last year, Kirsten Luke, who I believe is on the call, yep, there's Kirsten, and I developed a simple buffer tool to help identify locations for future black rail habitat creation. And really, this was just based on the need to have some place to start as far as directing partners where it would be better to try to start developing these inland marsh development and habitat management projects for black rail, instead of starting with the entire coastline. And this is available on our website, so I'll show you this at the end of the talk. But basically, this is based on an occupancy model for eastern black rails in tidal systems developed by Brian Stevens and Courtney Conway, which is currently in press. And then we added to it, this is an older screenshot, so we added to it basically a buffer of black rail locations that we are aware of in inland Florida as well. And so this gives areas within 30 kilometers where we have predicted occupancy for black rails, or known occupancy for black rails in the case of the inland Florida sites, basically to say, okay, if you're thinking about developing new black rail habitat, these areas have a better chance of succeeding because of dispersal from existing black rail populations. And what we did once we did those buffers was we removed some of the land cover types that we knew were not suitable for restoration. So we removed urban and impervious surface cover. We also removed some of the forest covers. So basically covers that we knew were not going to be easily transferred into, inland wetlands. Again, to further narrow where you could actually start a black rail habitat development project. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the American black duck. The American black duck is a little bit different than the black rail for several reasons. One, the American black duck is doing a little bit better than the black rail. So we know that this species experienced population declines in the 80s. However, in the recent decades, it has been much more stable. Black duck use both inland and coastal systems during the breeding season, but overwhelmingly use salt marsh systems during the non-breeding season as habitat. And so we focused on non-breeding habitat for the American black duck at the ACJV. You can see their distribution here. And so you can see it covers the vast majority of the ACJV. We're just missing a little bit of Florida and Puerto Rico. And this is the most recent plan that we've cranked out. This shows the final plan for all of our flagship species and our flagship habitat. So you can find this conservation plan on our website as well. In the case of the black duck, we have identified population objectives, but then also identified protection and restoration goals for the species. And that is based off of a decision support tool that we have jointly developed with Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited has really led the charge on this tool, and this also exists on our website. I will say it is an earlier version of the tool, and we are working to update it to the most recent version, and that should be happening more or less in August 2022. But this model is based on bioenergetics and harvest data, and identifies restoration, again, and protection priority watersheds at the Huck watershed level. Finally, we have ongoing science for the salt marsh sparrow. And the salt marsh sparrow, as a lot of you probably know, has had a lot of momentum, both in the level of regional science as well as regional conservation that's been occurring for the species over the last couple of years. The salt marsh sparrow is also declining quite steadily, roughly 9% annually for this species as well, and a very small existing population, which was estimated at roughly 60,000 individuals back in 2012, so about a decade ago. This bird is related to grassland birds, so part of its life history is also, indicative of that. They nest within inches of the ground, and that obviously can be quite problematic if you are nesting in a tidal marsh. Now, tidal marshes obviously are not all created equal. They can be easily broken up into different zones. The low marsh is flooded daily with the incoming and outgoing tides. However, the high marsh is flooded weekly to monthly with incoming and outgoing extreme high tides, which are linked to the lunar calendar, as well as extreme precipitation events. And of course, in that high marsh is where we find the salt marsh sparrow. And we know that the salt marsh sparrows need roughly a 24-day window in order to lay their eggs, incubate their eggs, raise their chicks, and get them healthy enough to fledge and escape an incoming high tide. Now, this is a video that kind of puts into pictures what I just told you in words. You can see an incoming extreme lunar tide coming into the salt marsh sparrow nest. This is a fairly early on nest. They still have eggs in there, and so the eggs are floating as the tide comes in and then goes back out. In the case of this nest, the mother comes back to incubate those eggs, and so we know that salt marsh sparrows and their nests can endure some flooding, but not much flooding. And so often what happens is these are not eggs, and so the incoming and outgoing tides will remove those nestlings from the nest, and the nest will not succeed. And we know that this is happening up and down the coastline, but because of that known bottleneck, that 24-day window, which is really shrinking due to climate change, sea level rise, which is exacerbated by this, human development of coastal marshes, especially in the Northeast. The salt marsh sparrow occurs from mid-coast Maine down to Florida, but we focus, and generally a lot of the conservation actions are focused in the Northeast, coming down into the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, because of that known bottleneck for the reproductive success is the known bottleneck for the species right now. And that is where their breeding area is. So we do have a salt marsh sparrow conservation plan that exists on our website, and like the other two species, we have identified population as well as short and long-term habitat goals for the species. This is an example of New York right here, but the states from Maine to Virginia all have population and habitat goals that exist in this plan. Now, in the case of the salt marsh sparrow, that's what I've been doing a lot of work on over the last year. And, I've been working very much in close partnership with Kirsten, again, to create documents for each state that outline priority marshes for restoration to benefit the salt marsh sparrow in the next 10 to 15 years. This goal was kind of developed by the Salt Marsh Sparrow Working Groups at the ACJV, and also the Salt Marsh Sparrow Executive Committee, which is a group of higher up leadership within each state, but is led by our regional director, Wendy Weber, to really try to kickstart conservation for this species now. The process that we used varied a little bit by state, where we created or joined working groups that were made up of salt marsh sparrow experts, but also included, people that were really familiar with marshes within the state for different reasons. We had some mosquito control, attending these as well, a lot of coastal scientists. So it was really kind of a nice mix of salt marsh sparrow ecologists, but then also salt marsh sparrow restoration ecologists and lots of other boots on the ground within each state. Because each state is different and faces different challenges, we then developed a prioritization process to fit those states' existing efforts, data, and needs. And the way we did that was by starting with the salt marsh sparrow habitat prioritization tool, which was a landscape scale tool that the ACJB developed and finalized, I think, in 2020. And this tool used landscape scale data to identify a rank for each patch of marsh from mid-coast Maine all the way down to Virginia, as far as how potentially important it was for the salt marsh sparrow. And it created a rank across the entire region and a rank within the state. So we used those ranks to help fuel and kickstart our process within each state. We took the top 10% ranked patches within each state, and then we reviewed them patch by patch, marsh by marsh, with our marsh by marsh review expert panel. And that included states, NGOs, academics, and federal representation, but was really led by the states. And so we had co-leads from each state from Maine to Virginia to help produce these documents. I'm really happy to say that all of these documents are now available on our website, which I will show you how to access in a minute. But really now we're thinking about what's next for the salt marsh sparrow. And so there's a couple things in the hopper that I wanted to touch on here so this group was aware. Really, the salt marsh sparrow data that we have is now over a decade old. The trend estimates are from 1998 to 2012. The population estimates were last done in 2012. So really what we're working towards now is a update of those estimates. This picture is me roughly a decade ago. My dissertation work was really informing those population estimates and trend estimates that I've been talking to you about now, but they're outdated. And so right now in 2021 and 2022, technicians are working to revisit all of those old points that we visited about a decade ago to help update those numbers and produce more robust trend estimates for the species. And that's a goal of, a little over 1,500 locations revisited 2 times a season, both in 2021 and 2022. And this is coordinated by SHARP, or the Salt Marsh Habitat and Avian Research Program. So what are we going to do with those data? Well, in addition to, updating those population estimates and trends, also it'd be really nice to know where the kind of quote unquote hotspots might be, both for current populations and also what the populations, where they're doing well over time and where they're not. And that really translates to density and occupancy rasters for the species that are that exist regionally. So this kind of pilot work has already been done in the Delaware Bay. And we are working to reproduce predictions for density and occupancy from Maine to Virginia. And again, we're doing that in collaboration with SHARP. There are obviously rasters that exist for the Delaware Bay and as well as coastal New Jersey now, all in draft form. And we hope to have them for the entire region from Maine to Virginia, more or less by August 2022. So stay tuned for that. And then also exploring vegetation community distribution and change using remote sensing. There is an existing layer for the Northeast where the salt marsh sparrow breeding range is that identifies high and low marsh. However, it needs to be updated and ideally would include a way to actually look at marsh change over time. And so we are working to update and replace that layer with a more updated layer and ideally a customizable tool. So we can look at change in vegetation community and marshes over time. Outside of where are they and in what numbers, coordinated monitoring across restoration sites is really important and becoming more important as more and more projects kind of land on the ground. So through partner programs at Fish and Wildlife, Sam Apgar, who I mentioned earlier and who took that video of that salt marsh sparrow, will be kind of heading this up and trying to coordinate these protocols across different restoration sites. So when practitioners are looking to monitor before or after change, they have a library of protocols to choose from that then can be compared to other sites afterwards. Also, there is kind of science coming out presently to improve restoration on the ground. The University of Connecticut is this is a photo from a visit to a Connecticut marsh a couple months ago, but practitioners at the University of Connecticut are pairing up with Sharp to really take a look at, what is the best way to manage for salt marsh sparrows. Like the black rail, we have a lot of ideas for how to improve marshes, but not a lot of success stories yet, because sometimes success stories take a long time to kind of show themselves, and we're very early in the marsh restoration process. So some of the stuff that is coming out is quite encouraging. This picture shows meter square plots where we've actually put down sediment and looked to see how quickly that area is revegetated, to kind of hope to extrapolate some of this across a wider area in the coming years. You can see these two quadrats that you can see like kind of outlined right there. That's only after a year and a half of regrowth. And so, sediment was deposited 7 to 10 centimeters in each one of those quadrats, yet it is completely revegetated. And I find that very encouraging as far as planning these, sediment placement projects in the years to come. And finally, we're working on continuing our collaborations with on-the-ground action, particularly among funding within our partners federally at the Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA, as well as Department of Transportation. Really, because coastal marsh systems are in this very developed part of the country, it requires a lot of partners working together to talk to each other when things are happening, to make sure new projects happen as well as they can and as inclusively as they can, to encourage healthy coastal marsh systems moving forward. So with that, this is my contact info and the overall ACJV website, but I will stop sharing for a minute and go to our website here. All right, and I can show you actually how to access everything. So if you go to the ACJV website, this is what you see. To access all of the plans, you go to conservation, and then any one of our flagship species you can click on and scroll down, and the conservation plan is available to you. But as far as the science tools that are available, you go to tools and data, and you can see all of the things that I've talked to you about today. The American Black Duck Decision Support Tool, you can click this and view the support tool. You zoom in and out. The black rail landscape prioritization tool, or the buffer tool that I talked to you about, that's also available here. This is in draft form and will likely be updated, but is available for use now. And you can see along the coastline from New Jersey all the way down to Florida. And those are those inland Florida sites that I was talking to you about. And then the salt marsh sparrow restoration priorities, and that was the last project that we talked about. All of those different state-led processes resulted in a hard copy document, and I actually have the Virginia document up here as an example for you all. So each one of those state documents, this is what it looks like. There's a goal statement, there's salt marsh sparrow objectives, there's a description of high-quality habitat and what that means for salt marsh sparrow, as well as a kind of a breakdown for the marsh identification prioritization process. And this is the area of Virginia where we find breeding salt marsh sparrows and the prioritization within that area. And then within each marsh that's been identified as a priority, we have a marsh summary. So for Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, this particular unit, we have a summary of the existing conditions. What does it look like right now? Any knowledge of the sparrows in the area, and the recommended next steps to management action. So what do we suggest happen next? So we have an overview map for the parcel that's identified, and then you move on to the next marsh complex. At the end, we have honorable mention sites, so sites that are also of particular interest but not necessarily the highest priority. And then we have suggestions for practices in marsh management, policy, and then acknowledgements, including the people who created the document, and then contact information if you want to learn more. So these static documents exist for all of our states, but then all the spatial data that they include, namely this stuff from each state, is available through this online mapper, which is what I clicked to originally. And so here you can, see the marshes that have been identified up and down the coastline. You can zoom into them. You can zoom into Virginia here. And then we can obviously see the key. Right now, only pretty cursory information is available. Basically the name, what level priority it is, and some basic information about area. However, in the coming months, I'm working on adding attributes to all of these data. So we can fairly easily sort by suggested management action or potential management action to see what sites might benefit from elevation enhancement versus ditch remediation or runneling, some of the other basic salt marsh restoration techniques that are occurring up and down the coastline. If you're interested in downloading the spatial data, you can do that here, and then you can get back to the documentation for each state here. All right, and with that, I think that's everything I wanted to show you all, so I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. Yeah, so we do definitely have time for questions. If anyone would like to jump in, you can just pop yourself off of mute, or you can use the chat box as well. A question in the chat: do you have plans to monitor SALS numbers in their wintering range and/or look into habitat protection there too?
Yeah, so there is some momentum to do that. So SHARP exists, and that research collaborative covers Maine down to Virginia. And for the past decade or so, we've kind of been talking about trying to get a SHARP South or a SHARP equivalent going on in the Southeast. And so we are in the beginning stages of trying to form that. There's a PhD student that's finishing up in Ray Danner's lab that I think is going to try to tackle that for her postdoctoral work. So yes, the idea is to take a look at the wintering habitat for salt marsh sparrows to understand a little bit more what they need and where that habitat exists. Okay.
Thanks. And yeah, one more from the chat. I'll just read aloud for the recording.
Go for it. Yep.
Do you get good communications with the states when they do any marsh restoration practices that affect the target species?
Yeah. So, I feel like the communication's pretty good there. We also have an inventory of projects for when restoration's actually happening on the ground. We try to track that progress across our geography to help have everything kind of in one location when we're trying to understand what exactly is happening on the ground. And the project inventory also exists on our website under the tools and data tab, I believe. So that's really the information tracking tool that we try to use, as well as obviously regular communication with the states. And that had been, that was going on really well when the working groups were existed for the state level documents. And so moving forward, we're trying to make sure that we keep that communication going. Yeah. Okay.
And another one in the chat from Michelle: do you plan on creating state-specific documents for Black Rail as well?
That's a good question. Not in the foreseeable future, just because we're kind of in a different place as far as data is concerned when it comes to Black Rail. So identifying particular parts of marsh that we suggest restoring, we're more at the buffer tool level of knowledge versus the identifying individual marshes for the Black Rail. And again, with the ACJV's kind of clear focus on the inland marshes specifically for the Black Rail, that gets a little bit fuzzier as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Great question, thanks. And then one more in the chat: do you try to facilitate opportunities for funding projects?
Yes, we do. That is a big thing that the ACJV does. And so, yes, the CSWIG that I told you all about, the ACJV had a hand in developing the content for that, although obviously state of Florida headed up that grant opportunity, and we do similar things for other funding opportunities, including NIFWIF, and we're also trying to figure out how to tackle some of the federal money that's currently available for coastal restoration work. So yes, definitely.
Beth, I see that you have your hand up if you want to go ahead and jump in.
Sure. I just want to say that great presentation, and I was on a meeting with Atlantic Coast Joint Venture folks and FWS trying to increase some collaboration in the Black Rail. And so I'm in Florida, and that, focus on the inland population. So I was able to get the data And so one of the projects I'm working on is working with NRCS Florida and implementation of their wildlife strategy, which has 5 species. Black rail isn't one of them, but I was looking for other priority species and to try to incorporate that where they can do work on their wildlife strategy. So I just an FYI for you, Maureen, that I included black rail information and tried to highlight where they're working on grasshopper sparrows or bobwhite quail, and there's intersection with some of those areas that those were highlighted and prioritized, so they could maybe get some win-wins and include some work through the NRCS Equip program. So
okay,
I guess a question in there too is do you know if there's been any directed work on providing guidance to NRCS through some of their private landowner programs to help with some of those inland populations of black rail?
That's a good question. I believe the answer is no, but I am not sure. That would be a good question for our coordinator, Amy Weldon. But I do know that we're working on guidance for black rail management, generally speaking. So that's why I think the answer is probably no, because we're working on it generally to be applied in a bunch of different places, and it's still very much in draft form. Yeah, that's another thing that we don't really have for black rail, but it's clearly a need. And so, yeah, that's kind of where things are.
Yeah, I pulled up the plan and I noticed there's some implementation guidance, and I can try to make sure to incorporate some of that, reference that document when they're trying, tying that to some of the practices they can do with the Equip program that may benefit black rail.
Yeah.
This is Kirsten here. Beth, I will send you a note. We are having some higher level conversations with NRCS and their programs, not specific to black rail, but more specific to marsh migration zones, and trying to have some, I guess, some overlapping stuff. Like we've only had a few meetings, but there are conversations happening directly with NRCS and the coastal area. So yes, but not specific to black rail.
Okay, well maybe there's some synergies there we can build on. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. Yay, I love it when connections happen on the web forum. That's why we're here. Any other questions or great ideas? All right, not hearing any. I think I will just share a quick update of next month's web forum, and then we can come back to Q&A at the end if something occurs to you in the meantime. So next month, let me move my camera over here. Next month, we will be hearing from Wes Boone, who is a postdoctoral researcher at NC State University. And I'm a big fan of the name of his talk. I love a pun, Brooding Over Climate Change Implications for Wild Turkey Reproduction. So this, I think, is going to be a really great presentation. Wes is studying essentially how climate change is influencing the temporal availability of the resources that are required for many different species to reproduce and survive. We're having more extreme weather events that can result in direct mortality, but it's not really clear on how climate change is going to affect wild turkeys, which are obviously a really economically and culturally important species. There's been a recent decline in eastern wild turkey populations in many portions of the U.S., so this is a relationship that he and his team really want to understand. So he's going to be talking about the results of this work, and we're going to co-host this web forum with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, as we sometimes do. So instead of the usual Teams connection, we'll be using Zoom, and I've put the link to that Zoom on the slide, but let me grab it and drop it in the chat as well. So this is one where you have the option to pre-register, though you don't have to if you just want to join at the day and time like you would for Teams. That's fine too. That should be the link to the Zoom for you there. So if you want to register for next month's web forum, we would love to have you. And then with that, I'd just like to wrap up on this slide about how to get more involved in SECAS. If you would like to get our monthly newsletter, you can sign up for that at secassoutheast.org. Or obviously, we as staff of the Southeast Blueprint and a SECAS are here to help you. You can reach out to us on the staff page or see who else is participating in SECAS governance on the partners page. And then we encourage you to explore the Southeast Conservation Blueprint online. If you would like help using it, we're here to assist you, and we'd love to hear how it's working for you and if you have any feedback. So with that, I will pause again for questions and just see if anybody else has a question for me or for Mo. All right, well, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. I really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in, and hopefully I'll see you in July. Have a great rest of your week.